I did my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, and there I focused on primarily on American religion and also sociology of religion. And while I feel like that was a really good base for me there, the currents that I ended up following were currents that really ended up questioning a lot about the way that we describe religion, which is not necessarily an interest that I had at that moment in graduate school. But one thing that I really was interested in graduate school about, and a path that I ended up pursuing there that I was not anticipating, is I did what's called a doctoral emphasis. It's almost kind of like it's the equivalent of like a major and a minor, right? But I did a doctoral emphasis in feminist theory. And I wasn't even aware of that program at the time that I ended up there, but happened upon it and had a huge interest in gender. And I must say that even more than my religious studies exposure, it was the critical theory that I was exposed to through the feminist theory department that made a huge difference in helping me rethink categorization. So I would say that although I was already exposed to many of the issues of the critical study of religion through both my master's work and some of my PhD work, it was really whenever I had this exposure to feminist theory that I began to ask some even larger questions about how those issues pertain to the study of religion. And as it turns out, they're very similar issues because both fields, one field is dealing with women and one field is dealing with religion. And this might require some explanation, but those two categories function in much the same way. So that was kind of the start of some of my interest, not only in gender and religion. And I still teach today feminist theory, and I direct our Women's and Gender Studies department. But I'm really interested in the ways, more generally speaking, that societies use gender as a mechanism to control people, and which is basically what gender is, but also how they use religious stories and religious myths in order to perpetuate that same sort of thing. So that's why I have an interest, or have had an interest, all along in thinking about Christian conservatives in the Christian right, and in trying to reconcile how certain ideas about gender and certain ideas about religion flow so easily together. And like I said, I think part of that is connected to the fact that the way that woman is often thought of socially speaking and the way that religion is often thought of socially speaking are categories that often go together, even though there is not necessarily any natural fit between the way that we use those terms. So yeah, is that enough of an introduction?
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's sort of funny because I think that if you had asked me this, 10 years ago, when I was in graduate school, I still would have answered the same way, which is interesting to me because it makes me wonder what I'll say in 10 more years. I still think the hesitation by scholars to ask critical questions about what has philosophically been called the nature of religion, but as a sociologist, I'd be more prone to call this the functions of religion, the way that religion operates socially. I think there is still, despite the fact that everyone claims to be beyond Iliade, I think there is still this tendency to view religion in a fairly phenomenological manner. I think there's still a tendency to think that if we describe some historical roots and political backgrounds, then we've really escaped from that legacy of thinking that religion is just something where we describe it and make lists of qualities and then we're done with our jobs. And I think still the fear, if I had to put it bluntly, the fear of reductionism, the notion that that we are all kind of duty bound in a way to talk about religion in a way that pleases the people we study to some degree. And that we're also bound to talk about religion as if it is this thing out there that we can't quite grapple with. Now, obviously, there are folks who argue that, and that's fine. But I think so long as we are very content to say that there is an essence out there that we can't quite put our fingers on, then I think that's going to stymie or really shut down the new paths that we can take in the study of religion. And I think that probably, while a lot of people feel that they moved on from that, and truly have, I don't want to say that it's been completely regressive or anything, but while I think a lot of people have moved on from that, I think at the same time we still struggle. I struggle with this too, with even the vocabulary we have to talk about religion is still filled with assumptions and essentialisms and really political agendas, if we wanted to be open about it, that are so part and parcel of just how we talk about religion that it takes quite an effort to get outside of that. So to me, that's the biggest problem. And I think that one of the things too that I might add on to that related is that for those of us who teach, there's a huge challenge with how to provide this more critical perspective in the classroom in a short period of time when students come to us with a more popular essentialist vantage point, because it usually takes longer than a few weeks to do the critical work, to talk students through the mechanics of society before we can even begin to start the conversation on religion. And so I think the more that these sociological or socio-critical perspectives become popular, the more that we as scholars are going to have to really pay attention to our pedagogy. I mean, to put it simply, we're going to have to really think hard about how we engage in our approaches in the classroom, because I think it's tempting to write one thing and then teach another, or to straddle the fence, so to speak. And if we're going to be serious about what we're communicating and the accuracy of the material we put out there in class, then we've got to find a consistency between those two, I think. I think one of the things that I really try to do in the classroom, and this is something probably that I've only done in the last few years, is I've really myself become more engaged in these issues, and so I'm trying to be consistent in that regard too. But I never teach a class where I'm not talking about theory. I am always overt that theory does not mean fantasy. Because I think that we have this tendency to talk about theory as if it's the make-believe world, and that theory's opposite is reality. If theory and reality don't match, then it's a bad theory, but that doesn't mean it's not theory, right? So I try to make that very clear. And I also, I think I spend a lot of time trying to let students know that there are social dynamics that occur all the time that remain unseen, and that because they're social actors, not everything that we know about the world as it is common sense. I think that many students come to the classroom expecting that their religious studies courses and other related courses are these fact bins where they're going to kind of open their mouths and we're going to throw stuff in, but they often don't approach that as a moment where they're learning to think entirely differently about the way that society is structured. So that's why I have a heavy emphasis on theory, and I define what theory is so that there's no mistaking, no mistaking the intentions there. But I also spend a lot of time not talking about religion in religion classes. And I think that's useful because religion, particularly in the States, is a very emotional concept, or it's emotionally laden. Lots and lots of loyalty lies with religion, even among non-religion people or non-religious people. There's a pretty strong sense that a religious person is a good person, right? So long as they don't take it overboard. And so there's a lot of cultural backlash to the idea that we might be able to break down religion and talk about it in another way, other than this confessional and largely positive way. So that's why I try not to talk about religion at first, and I provide examples of how society works, and we talk about identities and categorization, and we talk about politics, and we talk about power, and we talk about social relationships and privilege. And once we are all pretty much on the same page with that stuff, then I can introduce the idea that religion is just another cultural manifestation, just like we might talk about the economy, or just like the family, or just like education, or just like labor, just like any other social institution. We've got this one called religion here, and if we can agree that all of these other social institutions have these qualities and features of society, can't we say the same thing about religion? So yeah, so my tactic and the way that I try to really work a heavy theoretical perspective in, as I don't talk about religion for a while, which sounds kind of, it sounds kind of funny, but I find that that's the best way to do it, so that when we get to that conversation then about religion, we're all coming from a similar platform where we understand at least some of the basics of social mechanics, And then it's easy to see those reflected in religion. And those students who are religious, or who at least come from a background where they are very eager to either defend religion or not to think critically about religion at all, those students are then in a better place to be able to see the parallels, so that we're not spending so much time, talking past each other, if that makes sense. Culture on the Edge is a blog comprised of international scholars, and we all together write about strategies of identification. And that sounds kind of highfalutin. I'm trying to think if there's a simpler way to say it. I guess the most simple way to say it is we kind of write about how society works. And that seems very facile. But unless we understand how difference and division and categories exist, we can't even talk about the strategies through which we come to label and know and interact in the world. So a lot of our goal at Culture on the Edge is to talk critically about how identities are formed and shaped. And this kind of gets back to what I was saying about teaching, where I think a lot of people are under the impression that if something looks one way, it just must be. Right? Now, we all know examples of where that's true, and we all know examples of where that's not. But social dynamics are particularly difficult, because so many of the things that we experience in society we take for granted as just the way things are, or we presume that they are perfectly normal and natural the world over, when in fact they may very well not be. So what we try to do at Culture on the Edge is we try to ask some critical questions about the role that identity strategies play in making society work. Asking questions like, how must a person be portrayed in order to get this, and in order to get access to this sort of political power, or to be, or to be overrun by the press? And asking other questions about how, how the political battles that we often as scholars, are commenting on, perhaps it's not as easy as just saying that this guy's good and this guy's bad. Perhaps both of the people we're looking at are engaged in similar identity strategies or using similar arguments, even though on the surface it might appear that they're arguing for radically different things. So I think that that's probably the most expedient way to describe what we do, is we're looking for a sampler of all sorts of different sociological phenomena from everything. I know that I write a lot about stuff that happens in my personal life, or stuff that might happen in the classroom. Others write explicitly about things that are within their disciplines. Still others write a lot about things that are happening in the media. And so we're just looking for all the different ways that we can demonstrate that identity is not something that's limited to people, or identity management, I should say. It's not something limited to people who are running for office, or, public figures, or people with PR firms, right? That we're all engaged in identity management. And that is what lubricates the political wheels that are society. So now that I've worked all that out verbally, I guess I would say that we write about identity management, which is a pretty tricky process once you start looking at it. What I was trying to accomplish in my book was I was trying to demonstrate that the way that scholars have up to this point understood conservative Christians in the U.S. in particular, but the critique applies to many other conservative religious folks too, was that scholars have mostly talked about conservative Christians as, well, conservative, in the sense that they don't change, that they stand by these very rigid moralist platforms, and that they are absolutists, and they have very black and white worldviews, and that because of this, the best way to describe them is as just that, as these people who do not change, and the rest of us out here, we're flexible and we change all the time, and scholars have openly used this as a way to demonize conservative religious groups. Now, my focus in writing was not at all to lend support to that demonization, nor was it to rally for conservative groups. I just found it sort of ironic as I was doing this research that it seemed to me that many of the same rhetorical tactics and many of the same ways that scholars who did not like conservative groups, the ways that they were talking about fundamentalism, were not too far afield from the ways that fundamentalists themselves spoke. So I wanted to ask some critical questions about what it meant to see a group that's very powerful, at least in American society, and to know that scholars say that this group doesn't change, or doesn't change, measurably across time. But in many of the observations that I had made of these groups, I actually saw quite a lot of changes. Other scholars were seeing them too. They just tended to dismiss them as, in fact, many of the scholars have dismissed these changes as just peripheral. They're on the edge. They're not fundamental changes. But again, the more that I looked at that, the more I really disagreed, frankly. I was seeing over time, some shifts from some really prominent Christian right groups, and those shifts were, if you compared them philosophically to their earlier statements, they were radical shifts. So what I decided to do was to study one of America's largest conservative women's organizations that's also a member under this Christian right political umbrella, and they're called Concerned Women for America. And I spent close to a decade studying the rhetoric that they produce on their website, which at this point in time is the primary way that they communicate with the public. And Concerned Women for America is a very, very traditional, very classically conservative organization. It's very much like other Christian right organizations. It's anti-abortion, it's anti-gay rights, it's pro-traditional family, it tends to be pro-military. It has all of the features that we often see of these groups. So on the surface, there's not a lot that's actually unique about that particular group, except that they've just been around a long time and they've got a lot of clout. But what drew me to that group in particular was that they're comprised almost exclusively of women. And because of that, they're able to use a rhetoric in public about gender and reproduction and sex that other kind of male-dominated Christian right groups probably didn't have as much authority in using. Or, politically speaking, these other groups just, again, would not have had as much clout or would not be as naturally believable as CWA would, on these matters. So, as a person obviously having an interest in gender and sex and reproduction and how they impact public policy, it occurred to me that this would be a really, really good place to look if I wanted to see these dynamics at hand. And then that grew into an exploration of trying to figure out exactly how it was that groups such as CWA could make claims that at times were illogical, blatantly. At other times might have some evidence to it, but was still a little tenuous. And still at other times be quite effective persuasively to a large group of people who otherwise probably had very disparate interests. They're known for being a very conservative group, but I really wanted to know how could it be that a conservative group could attract the loyalties of a pretty diverse number of Americans, even though those Americans might not necessarily buy into their religious philosophy. And so that's why I began to talk about and form the model for chaos rhetoric, which is the idea that there is a special way of speaking that inspires negative emotion in the listener, and that special way of speaking uses different strategies to push the listener towards resolving the problem, and the resolution is a political one. It's by voting in a particular way or by donating to CWA. But the reason why the logic within this rhetoric or within this chaos rhetoric becomes believable in the first place is because it uses a certain form of symbolic relationships that make it sound quite logical to those who hear it. And when we know that we're in a heightened emotional state and when the emotions we're experiencing are negative anyway, there are certain messages that are more believable to us in those heightened states. And there are certain relationships between symbols or between things that we're more likely to want to buy into than we would otherwise be if we weren't. Hopefully you can edit that out. If we weren't already in that heightened emotional state. So an example that I give in the book is that as a parent, I might not be concerned that my children are going to be molested by a gay Boy Scout master, right? Which has been an allegation that has recently come up as the Boy Scouts, certain members of the American Boy Scouts have been campaigning to permit gay scoutmasters or gay adult leaders, right, to run some of the individual groups. So it's not a concern of mine, not at all. On the other hand, I can relate to the concern that there might be people who wish my children ill. And I can relate to the concern that one of the ways in which they might be harmed, it might be through sexual abuse. So even though I don't necessarily agree with the politics that inspires the original fear, I can understand on some emotional level the sentiment that might inspire that fear in the first place. And so chaos rhetoric works to not only make me fearful, if I'm applying this to myself, but it also works to create a string of logic together so that I associate my fear with gay scoutmasters, or at least with gay people, and I subsequently associate that fear with gay scoutmasters. And so even without really having to think about it, it comes full circle. There's quite a bit of evidence that, most of the things we say we believe are not beliefs that we can logically back up. They're just feelings, gut responses to things. So groups like CWA do their work quite effectively, not if they can necessarily convince you of every piece of the logic along the way, but if they can just even make you feel uneasy, then that's a major part of it. But what I go on to show in the book is that all groups that want to persuade use chaos rhetoric. It's not unique to CWA. It's not unique to conservatives. We can find literally almost everyone who wants to, produce some sort of political effect or result will use the same technique in order to create a heightened emotional situation that can be symbolically connected to other things that elicits a response. So that's really important to me to demonstrate because, back to what I said earlier, lots of scholars use themselves chaos rhetoric to describe the Christian right's chaos rhetoric, ironically. So again, the book is not at all an active advocacy for or against the Christian right. I make clear in the book that my personal alliances are not with the Christian right, but that my intent there is simply to show how a certain form of rhetoric takes shape in creating certain identities, and that those in turn create very real political conditions. Yeah, I guess I'd ask you what you mean by a public intellectual. I think it's impossible to achieve objectivity, right? There's no such thing as a perfect objectivity. I think there are positions that might more accurately describe some social phenomena than others. So I think that when we're talking about, objectivity as a notion, that we might say that there are closer notions than further. But this whole question of what a public intellectual is, and there are many different discussions going on about that, is really, to me, a question about what religion is. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we wanted to boil it down to that. Mm-hmm. There are many who say that not only does the term public intellectual mean that you need to present your information in a way that is very accessible to the public, but that you must also, to some degree, engage in advocacy as a part of your scholarship, and that the reason why we do scholarship in the first place is to make the world a better place. So that's, obviously that's one thread of thinking. I think making the world a better place is a lovely thing. I like the world being better and a place, but I think at the same time that to say that is our job completely obliterates the fact that we don't all agree on what that is. So, there's also a ton of other critical issues at play there. So the only thing that I can come down to then is if I'm a scholar, and if I know that there is not consensus on what makes the world a better place, and if I am also not myself a person who can take a position on that makes all people happy, right? Then I also have to stop and ask, is my job to make the world a better place, right? Am I a humanitarian at the end of the day? And that's really not my job, in my opinion. And I know that this is obviously feeding into the earlier public intellectual discussion that you mentioned, but my job is to provide critical analysis of how things work. If there are others who want to take that information and to make the world a better place in the way that they wish, however they interpret that great. And in fact, that is part of what happens, right? But I think one of the things that we have to take very seriously as scholars is that there's a lot of pressure in the academy to speak about topics like social justice, and there's a lot of pressure to speak about topics about civil and human rights, and these are all things that that I care personally deeply about. But I won't pretend like my notion of civil rights and social justice is the same for everyone, or that there's some self-evident standard out there, because that's another essentialist argument at play that, again, I can't prove or disprove. I can only talk about the social circumstances that made those ideas appear desirable in the first place. So my tendency when we get into those discussions about the responsibility of the public intellectual is to say that that I'm not even sure I would use the word responsibility, because I think we're already wading into some ethical waters that I'm not entirely comfortable floating around in. But I would say that I see my job is to as accurately describe social dynamics and their various components as well as I can. And then if there are others who, through their scholarship, wish to engage in that, that's terrific. Or other activists who do, that's fine as well. But I think we also delude ourselves if we think that the scholarly perspective on what social justice is some sort of universal perspective, which I think often is something that goes unspoken. You only have to study fundamentalist groups for just a little bit of time to figure out pretty quickly that the scholarly version of what social justice is, of course, depending on the group and depending on the scholar, but that version of justice and rights often does not match a very large portion of the world. And that's like really asking scholars, to boil it down to who's right and who's wrong. And that's a path many scholars are very happy to pursue. But again, I am, as a person interested in analyzing social dynamics, and as a person more interested in asking why certain groups cast something as right and why certain groups cast something as wrong, why certain groups choose to call something social justice and why certain groups deny that term. I'm more interested in the mechanics of how those words work as categories of power in the world than I can make any solid declaration that I think is going to address every concept in some sort of universal way. Yeah, no, I totally think so, and maybe I should make something else clear too, and maybe this fleshes this out. But I don't mean that to say that I personally think that nothing is wrong and everything is right, and people can murder, rape, and pillage, and I'll just say, it's just you're just doing your discourse. I clearly have personal feelings, as most people do, about these sorts of things, right? I think. And there are plenty of fine scholars who do good work who also, engage in activism using or through their work. I simply am someone who is not going to call activism academics. I just don't want to mix the two up. So I might, on my personal time, have certain political feelings that I share or speak about, but I'm not going to mistake those for critical analysis. Does that make sense? So I think that one of the ways in which the public intellectual prototype at the moment remains highly normative. Yeah. Is it shifting towards someone who says, "Hey, my job is not necessarily to comment on one side or another. My job is, to provide critical analysis on the situation, if not also to comment on your claims to normativity." Yeah, I mean, it could very well be that. But saying that critical analysis is not the same as activism is actually a really important part of this equation, because there is a lot of stuff that is presented today as scholarship that is nothing more than, look at these crazy people. We've now studied them extensively. We've talked about all of their various qualities. We know about their history and their politics. We know what they like to eat for dinner. We know what they take in their coffee. And now we've got to find a way to stop them. And that may, perhaps personally, I feel the same way. But I'm not going to call that activist stance critical analysis, because it's not. So I see the sort of public intellectual role as one that tends to be focused on normativity at the moment. And I think one of the reasons why there is a call for the public intellectual is so that some of the theoretical models that many activist intellectuals are using can be applied to social situations, which is great. And I do think that what we write should be readable to more than like 3 people. I've said before that when I write something, I have my mother in mind, and that so far has been a good standard. But if we're going to be serious about that, then what that might mean is that sometimes in our critical analysis, we're going to be uncovering things that may not necessarily jive well with the current normative standards of the prototypical public intellectual. And it may reveal that certain groups operate much like the groups that they claim to detest. And it might mean that we find out some things that we don't necessarily like. So I will be interested to see whether this sort of critique of public intellectualism that I've given here, I'll be interested to see how it unfolds among at least my generation of scholars, some of whom are interested in these same methods. Because a lot of what we talk about, even though we might personally support some of the politics that come from these things, there are also some other things that we're discussing that often reveal some uncomfortable relationships. And it will be interesting to know, it will be interesting to see the strategies that groups use to negotiate these things in light of the information that we publish. We'll see. Well, I've already discussed a little bit about the public lecture. That was really a presentation over my book, which is, which was the discussion of the role that Concerned Women for America has played in determining the politics of, or in influencing not only the politics of the Christian right, but also the politics of American culture pertaining to sex, gender, and reproduction. So I'll set that one aside. The class this week was a class entitled The Politics of Fundamentalism. And I was interested in looking not only at how fundamentalists operate politically within various cultures, but I was also interested in thinking about, with kind of a double entendre regarding politics, I was interested in thinking about the politics that scholars use in talking about fundamentalism. So it was really an approach to politics on at least 2 and perhaps more angles. And I was working on the premise that fundamentalists as members of culture must work through those political channels in order to come up with the identity categories that give them political power, but so must scholars too. And fundamentalism is one of those terms. I have before referred to it. It and feminism is the dirty F word. But it's one of those terms that's very widely used in a pejorative fashion. It's very frequently used as an insult. There are some groups who will very proudly wear it as a banner, almost as if they were martyrs. I mean, so the term itself is highly volatile, and I wanted the students to be able to see how. Because so many fundamentalists, politically speaking, stand in opposition to so many of the more liberal scholars who describe them, that it's a very difficult thing to, if impossible, frankly, to talk about fundamentalists through the literature as if we had this impossible neutral observation of them, that the scholar's lens was one that was clear and unclouded, and that we would be able to all conclude at the end that fundamentalists were dangerous and unfortunate, and that they had tarnished our wonderful religions. So we worked through looking at some major definitions of fundamentalism. We talked about some of the presumptions about fundamentalists that scholars often presume, that they are anti-modern, that they are anti-secular, that they are irrational, that they are textual literalists, that they are moral dichotomists, and all sorts of things like this. And then we spent some time asking the question also, is fundamentalism bad religion? Is that how it's portrayed? And what we discovered is that there is embedded within many critiques of fundamentalist religion, that there is in fact the sense that fundamentalism does represent some sort of tarnished religion that went wrong, but that ends up really being an essentialist sort of theological argument in and of itself. Because the only way that you can say that is if you hold out there a good, positive, pure religion that would have been all okay had the fundamentalists never ruined the party, right? So from that point, I introduced them to my theory of fundamentalism more as a rhetorical move that any group can use, and not just a state of being that group and that group over there have, that in fact almost anyone and any group can function as fundamentalists so long as they use a certain type of speech and appeal to certain types of authority and tend to regard the world in very dichotomous ways. And then we spent the last couple of days thinking about what role fundamentalism plays in directly being implicated in the way that the world operates. What does it mean when certain stereotypes of fundamentalism are dominant? What does it mean when we're constantly inundated with a discourse on good religion? What does it mean even when scholars are fighting amongst themselves as to whether or not certain forms of fundamentalism should just be permitted to exist out of deference and diversity? Are those scholars still speaking from a position that may have a heavy dose of essentialism injected into it? So those were some of the questions that we were trying to ask, and so it was not only, it was partially looking at examples of worldwide fundamentalisms, but it was also asking whether that term fundamentalism is useful at all anymore, and why some scholars have said it is useful and others have said it's not, and then asking some more questions about whether or not we can begin to say that perhaps governments can be fundamentalists. That perhaps individuals who have no religious affiliation can be regarded as fundamentalists, and so on. So it was really kind of an exercise in looking at how scholars have portrayed the dirty F word, but also what we as scholars, to some degree of scholars, might say about their treatment of it, and what that tells us about whether fundamentalism really is a unique thing. And my conclusion about that is no, it's not unique at all. It's a tactic that's used to elicit persuasive force, and that kind of very closely to the theme of my book, we probably all engage in what could be called fundamentalist rhetoric at some point or another, and some of us more than others. But to me, whenever we begin to think about fundamentalism, that those crazy people, as that thing that those crazy people over there do, then we have begun to engage in an identification strategy that creates difference and demarcates this sort of other over there, and we fail to see the parallels perhaps in our own speech, or parallels in the speech or the social strategies of groups far closer to us that we've simply normalized. And so talking about all those issues was a lot of what we attempted to do this week in the discussion on fundamentalism. You're welcome.